Welcome back to the Macro Golf YouTube channel. We're back here with Levi. He's back on the channel, probably the month, back down here at Chapel Springs Golf Centre. And today we're going to talk about the legs, so kind of lower half, right?
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about legs and feet and the way that the legs move in the golf swing, the way that the feet move in the golf swing. So Levi, this is opening a big can of worms.
Correct, yeah.
Where the hell do we go from here? What's going on with the lower half?
Well, this is the thing. We can't talk about the legs without talking about the feet. We can't talk about the feet without talking about things like ground force reactions.
Okay.
Right? So this is where we're going to then start talking about sort of pressure points. This is where we're going to start talking about forces, how we can apply them, and basically as well what some players are missing to get into these issues.
Yep. And I suppose this will be linked to many swing faults or swing issues that people are experiencing. So I'm sure you've seen it, I've seen it a lot as well, when just improving the way that people react with the ground has a big change in the way that they swing the golf club and the results they then get and the reaction they have down with the floor in terms of reacting down with the ball as well. So where do we start? With the other videos we've started always with set up and then working through the different phases, stages. So where do we do it with the legs? What's the best way for us to go through this? Because I think there's so many areas to cover. We want to make sure we cover it all, as we've always tried to do with these videos. I'll open the floor up to you. Yeah. Where do we start? Okay. Sorry to put you on spot.
No, it's fine. Not a problem at all. Right, so obviously, like we said earlier, we cannot talk about the legs without talking about the feet. So it's very important that, first of all, that we have some form of balance and stability in the ground.
True.
Right? So when we get into what we spoke about earlier in past videos with good posture, is that feeling that we're nice, balanced, and athletic in the ground.
Yep.
Right? So when it talks about the feet, it's very important when we spoke about balance that we don't sit in the heels too much and we don't then work on the toes. We don't work on the toes too much, because it's very important that when we then end up getting these pressure shifts, that we can use the feet appropriately. So to obviously, let's say if we're 50-50, toes to heels, but also right foot and left foot. So we're talking about long game, not necessarily short game here. Good posture, but we also use things like the toes to actually push to get the weight then transferred into the heel. And then we could also as well use the toes and the parts of your feet that you jump from, so more like the front part of your feet rather than the heels, to actually then transfer weight, whether it's transferring into the left, but also as well transferring into, let's say, the left heel and things like that.
So just a few things on that in terms of the setup. So what are some things that are going to be typical for people that you see when people come in with? So you said there about weight being maybe too far back onto the heels, too far close on the toes. So what can people do to just check their setup to make sure? Is there a kind of little checkpoints people can go through, little kind of a setup drill they can go through? I always look at setup in terms of the way that their posture is set. Is there something we can do in terms of the same for the golf swing?
Yeah, I think there's some basic stuff that you can do. If I didn't want to use one of the brand new clubs, right? But if we get let's say a club on the floor and we use the grip and we're going to basically use the foot, the middle part of the foot, to then stand on the grip, then you can distribute either the toes or the heel. So if you're nice and balanced, you're obviously going to feel nice and balanced. But if you're sitting on your heels, you're going to notice your chest then wants to come up. Obviously, if we do this at address, imagine what is going to happen when we're in motion. So there's a term that we use, it's called statics influence dynamics. So if I'm messing around, let's say trying to obviously find out where good balance is, if I now go onto my toes, I'm going to really kind of like struggle moving. I will be able to have some form of rotation, but I'm naturally going to want to shift up more. Yeah. If I then sit on the heels, I'm not going to be able to rotate at all. I'm going to be able to, have to throw my arms at it because the chest is coming up.
So does that have an influence then on ball position as well? So obviously ball position being too far away or being too close, is that going to affect one's then setup, but then ultimately how we're using the ground, which is just crazy to think that just by moving the ball a little bit further away or a little bit closer to you is going to change so much further down the line. But where you're getting to there, it seems like that's inevitable. It's going to happen, right?
Correct, yeah. So obviously the chest coming up, we're playing a stationary ball game. So as let's say a baseline, if the hands, wrists and arms start obviously underneath the chest, let's say if this is like a pitching wedge, so we're obviously quite low to it, hands, wrists and arms are quite vertical. It's very important that the arms work that up and then they work back down underneath the chest, underneath the shoulders. If you're on your heels, your chest is then going to come up, and then it's very difficult to then get the hands, wrists and arms back down underneath. So you're going to start off with, let's say, a pitching wedge sort of spine angle position, and then you'll probably end up into a little bit more of like a 7-iron, 6-iron, potentially even 5-iron. So this is flattened out. Ball striking can very, very much be, you know, inconsistent because of that.
And is that relative to arm length, leg length? So everyone's going to have their optimal position?
Yeah, correct. Spot on, right? So some people say that optimal height to play golf is about 5'8", 5'9".
Okay.
Because your center of gravity, center of mass is so much more planted in the ground. If you're something like 6'10", you're miles away from the ground. Obviously, optically, you know, like from a vision standpoint, but also as well your center of mass. Mm-hmm. So it's very, very important that, like I said, you get into good setup, get into good positions. And what you'll find is that the taller the player, you're better off with a wider base because you can actually get lower to the ground. If you was going to then go into a narrow base, you'd then have to go for more hip hinge. And the more hip hinge you have, the harder it is to move.
Yeah.
So you'd much rather go with a bigger base, get your center of mass down through leg pressure, and then you're a lot closer to the ground and you can actually move that way. And
again, it's all going to be matched up to body type, right? There's not going to be kind of one absolute textbook. And I think what then happens is people would maybe follow a generic rule that they've seen, and maybe that doesn't suit. So I think what we're trying to say here is finding your optimal setup and your optimal position for your body type, the shot that you're trying to hit, obviously is a big part of that as well. The club you're hitting is going to make a big difference to everything that then happens.
I think you find that through, obviously, logic. You find that through practice and experience. But also, as well, you find that through maybe even sort of like getting some form of advice. Because not everybody knows that. Some people will then try and stand shoulder width apart, being 6'7", let's say, trying to get down. Their clubs are too short for them. All of these things then come into account. So you have to really kind of feel things and, you know, trying to get comfortable more than anything.
For sure. Hard in this game, feel comfortable.
It's very difficult.
Very
it's
difficult.
Such a mental game, obviously.
It's
golf.
true.
Yeah.
So let's say we've got into a great setup position. How do we now start to use the ground as the swing starts? So obviously we spoke about the different phases and stages in previous videos. So let's talk about this initial loading of the body through into the backswing. So how would the legs and feet start to react with the ground, and how would they move correctly in the backswing?
Yeah. So the feet can act either as a brake or an accelerator, right? So the right foot acts as a braking system in the backswing. So some players, some golf coaches actually like to start off the backswing or start off in a dress actually with their weight on their left foot.
Interesting.
Because they might struggle getting over into their right side. So when you see some of these long drivers, or you see some players on tour like Henrik Stenson or a Matt Fitzpatrick, or even McIlroy sometimes, he will actually start off by using the left foot to actually push over to get the weight onto the right foot. Mm-hmm. So the left foot is almost acting as a bit of a push-off, a little bit of an accelerator just to get their weight onto their right foot. This is good for some players. This is obviously good for everybody. So let's say if we go with the generic kind of like player, so we would get the weight, let's say 50-50 at address, and then as we're then coiling up the body, we're going to obviously get the pressure points working around the toes into the heel. So the right foot, where we obviously, let's say, pressure up into this right side, the right foot acts as a braking system. Mm-hmm. The weight goes from the toes into the heel. So the toes end up actually almost like pushing to get the hip around and up, if that makes sense. Rather than if we didn't act this as a braking system and something to push off of, we would then obviously stack off over it. And then the problem is we can either then use the upper body to then do this, or we can then overcompensate and then push over. So it very much comes down to sequencing and timing when it comes to this movement. So the top of the backswing, the weight is moving around and up. So the hip is working around and up. The right foot is pushing into the ground, which is what's making this right hip work high. So the right leg will straighten a little. It doesn't lock. It straightens a little. As the left leg moves in, it naturally happens because obviously the pelvis is rotating. But the right foot is pushing into the ground, which is then obviously, like I said, acting as a braking system. Soon as we kind of get 70% roughly into this right heel, we can then use the right foot, the right toes to then actually transfer some weight and then some pressure down into this left side. So it acts as a braking system and then it acts as an accelerator to get the weight transferred into the left.
It's a great description. And I suppose the key for this, which is something I see a lot in confusion of golfers is the timing of which this occurs in the swing. So I almost like to see, I think this is different for everyone in terms of how they feel that they're doing it.
Yeah.
But we seem to have some consistency, and the best players in the world seem to be doing it similar times.
Correct, yeah.
Similar, nothing exact. But for you, for example, as you start to make this backswing, at what point
should you start
are you starting to feel that? Yeah, because
Correct.
I think maybe it's happening before you're feeling it. I don't know if I'm maybe right in there,
100%.
but it's definitely, we're going to start to experience a movement. My guess will be earlier than what a lot of people will be guessing before you give them the answer.
This is very personalised, right? So obviously where Joe is quite hesitant to say exactly at what time, and he's kind of asking the right questions of saying like, you know, at what time, there is no correct time for players because it depends on what you're working on. It depends on what your tendencies are, right? So if I get a player that struggles, let's say, getting into their right side and actually holding in position as then the arms then come down, I'm going to say to him, you've got to keep the pressure in there for longer. But then for some players, it could be you need to do it earlier and you can't do it early enough.
Yeah.
So there could be some mixed messaging for some people on that, but it very much is like blowing up a balloon until it bursts. You've got to know when to tie the knot on certain things.
Yeah.
Right? So can you do too much or will you do too much are two obviously very different points. So what we want to kind of feel with some players is that roughly around counter rotation phase, which is obviously where we spoke about in the first lesson that we did, was that roughly when the left arm reaches parallel, or it could even be, let's say, sort of like shoulder height, that is where we're going to start seeing the weight transfer and start shifting into this left side. If you have a look at players like Rory McIlroy in slow motion, he will very much spiral up the body. So hands, wrists and arms get to around sort of chest height. Everything's really, really stretched up into this position here. And then as he is then completing his backswing, you'll then even see his weight shift into this left side as he finishes completing his backswing. So for players, we could do this very, very late on, as in terms of almost feel that you hold your right side. And for other players, get there earlier if you're a player that tends to hang back and spin on this right side.
Yeah, I'm so glad you described it like that as well, because it is very personal.
Very personal.
That feeling is going to be super personal, although then maybe there's a more optimal time than other times. Sometimes people are doing it too late. Very rarely people do it too early, I would say, but a lot of the time it's too late. But the perception of it is key. And I think for some people, what that feels like to them is the hard bit that you've got to try and get across. And that's why your job is so difficult, right? Because everyone that walks in is going to feel something completely different. And you're having to discover and dig in with good questions to what are they experiencing? Does that feel like it's happening at what time? And then trying to get some cues in place for them to help with them. And I think, for anyone watching this, it's a discovery mission really to try and work out for them what the best way will be. But
you spot on. And the thing is as well, these videos are very much not just one trick pony. We're not, basically saying this is what you have to do. It's trying to give you options. It's trying to give you some form of education of what really kind of happens. So there might be, let's say, some comments or let's say some questions in the comment section of, this is what I have. This is why you need to have some form of a, personalization golf lesson, right? Rather than going, let's go on YouTube, let's type in, let's say something like a slice, right? There is more than 10 ways to slice a golf ball, not just one. So this is the thing. If you look at really kind of like the sort of like the cause and effect of slice, obviously it's the club face is open to path and obviously on a severe amount, but there's so many ways of that happening.
Yep.
So these videos are very much down to really kind of like the biomechanics of really what kind of happens rather than actually what your cause and effect could be.
Yeah, for sure. And it's definitely, I think that's nice because it opens up people's thought processes on why things are happening the way they're happening. It's starting to get people to ask the right questions, which I think is whole part of what we're trying to do here. So we've spoken a little bit about how the foot pressures, we've spoken a little bit about how the legs work. There's obviously going to be a natural straightening of this trail side, natural kind of folding or bending of this lead side. So as we start to transfer pressure, what then starts to happen? Because obviously this is going to continue to rotate as we start to press down onto the other side. So we're starting to see the difference between pressure and movement, rotation and forces and all these things. maybe we'll do a whole separate video on the difference between pressures
we
and
can
forces.
talk about ground force a bit
which
more.
maybe we will do a separate video on that. But in terms of how the legs are going to start to move and how the feet start to move, this transitional period seems to be key. So let's just talk a little bit about how that starts to now transfer into more of a downswing position than maybe, and how things start to move.
Yeah, perfect. Right. Okay. So this is going to be great for players with early extension.
Here we go.
Really, really good.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So early extension can come through different ways, but this is an excellent drill for you to understand pressure points and how we can get out of it. So normally what happens with things like early extension is obviously where the weight distribution can be a bit wrong. We obviously start pushing from the ground too early, which is obviously extension, and it's happening too early. So when we obviously said to some players that we can't do this early enough, early extension, it's not the worst thing in the world. It really, really isn't. But obviously some people look at it, hate it, want to get rid of it. So this is obviously going to help.
Yeah, it's a good point you said that, because there's a difference between extending early and transferring weight early, right? So they're kind of two different things. But I think sometimes early extension just gets labelled as one big thing, where actually it's not quite on the same path of what you got onto there, which was, you know, the time of which you start to shift onto your left side is different to early extension, right?
Yeah, correct.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, well, all extension is, obviously, it's a phase in the golf swing that happens around impact. It would be the same as like boxing. It would be the same as throwing, so like javelin or anything to do with like tennis. There needs to be some form of extension going through, which is obviously making the hit. It's putting the pressure basically throughout the shot. Yeah. Which kind of is like the release of it. Yeah. Right. So you either can create, let's say, no downforce, which, you know, to me, I look at, let's say, extension as some form of downforce. Right. So you're creating, let's say, some form of stretch here. Early extension is simply where, let's say, the weight gets onto the toes too much, so it never really gets transferred into the heel. It gets onto the toes and it stays on the toe too much. There is actually a lack of ground force. Yeah. There's a lack of pushing in the feet. It hangs around the toes too much, and then obviously you push from the front parts of your feet, but instead of actually getting pushed backwards, it gets pushed down to obviously then go up. So instead of pushing this way to go this way, we push in that direction to then obviously go up. Yep. We get closer to the ball, come out of posture, handle then goes higher. So the handle then going higher opens up the club face. And also as well, we can then mess around with things like rotation of the body, and then we can react to that and shut the face down. Comes a bit roulette, really.
So that extension you just showed there, I think it's quite important. I know we jumped ahead a little bit, but that extension that we've got there, which is the lack of reaction working you back, and it's making you work more vertically. Could that also be a fault? I'm going to be really careful with my words here. Could that also be a fault, even if it's happening at the correct time? So could it be that someone doesn't move early up here, but the only force they produce is this way? Do you see what I'm trying to get at here? So it's not necessarily early extension, it's just that they extend without any kind of rotational force.
Well,
does that make sense?
Yeah. So let's say if it's extension, or let's say, trying to think what you're saying, and I'm trying to sort of articulate it correctly.
Do a demo.
Go for it. About time we saw Joe over
So what I mean is, obviously, we're talking with early extension of people coming in early, this thrust towards the ball and pumping forward. Yeah. But could that move still happen, but not be early?
Oh, correct. Yeah.
So that movement happens at the correct time, but it's a wrong movement.
Correct. Yeah. So if we look at something like Brooks Koepka. Okay. As a great example, right? So if you ever get a chance, go onto YouTube, Brooks Koepka, let's say down the line, driver, right? So Brooks could, let's say, work it down in position, be in a fantastic position, and then belt buckle, instead of going back and up, it would go up a bit more. Yeah. So his backside would actually almost shift and tuck under just a fraction. But the thing is, his belt buckle isn't facing forward, it's facing more this way. So if you were to do
like the classic draw a line on the back of your bum, let's see if you've moved off the line.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Okay, so I understand. So is it be all end all? No, not at all. Because like some of the elite players, even Jack Nicklaus used to do that. So as long as the extension isn't too much, obviously, like I said to you earlier, it's very much depends on whether it's an extreme, and it depends on whether it really kind of affects you. So like, you know, you could have early extension, loads and loads and loads. Or you know what? We could have a look at somebody like Scotty Scheffler, right? So not even talk about early extension necessarily anymore, but the ground force where some players might even look at him, or sorry, some people might even look at him and say, like, he's not even like stable at all on the ground. It looks like he's about to fall over.
Yeah.
But yeah, best player in the world, you wouldn't even go near it. The only time you'd ever go near it is if it's caused an injury.
Yeah.
As a performance standpoint, keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah, it's crazy, really, when you think about it that way. And we talk about how we react. There's obviously a lot of good going on there, right? It looks ugly.
There's a lot of control.
But there's a lot of good.
He's done it for a long time. He's become great at it. And this is a thing, what we spoke about before, like with wrist positions being a unicorn. Leave players like that to him. The minute that you would try and change somebody like that, the minute that he stops becoming Scotty Scheffler, basically. Yeah.
Let's just hope that never happens.
Okay.
So let's get into this transition thing.
Yeah. Okay.
Or if he does want to change it, come down and see you at Chapel Gold Spring. You'll sort it out. So let's see how this starts to go through transition. We've obviously spoken how we got to the top. We spoke about how we load. Now we're starting to transition through. What are the movements? What are the positions? What are we starting to see here in the body?
So what we want to see is obviously on the weight shift, we want to see not necessarily just right foot to left foot, but we also want to see the weight distribution change from, let's say, the right foot. Let's say if I coil it up to the top, and I'll actually explain that a bit better, right? So let's say if I coil it up the top there, load it up, and then I want to get the feeling that my right foot on the toes is going to push to get my weight into the left heel. But to do this, I'm going to feel that my belt buckle goes diagonally backwards to then get my weight shifting into my left foot. So what you'll feel is that you'll feel a little bit of loss of height naturally because you're hinging a little bit more for your pelvis. This is fantastic. This is really, really good for players that have early extension. And this is also great for players that tend to spin out and hang back on their right foot. So if we work it up to the top, nice and coiled up, and then get the feeling that the belt buckle is working across, like in the line of this golf club, which is about 45 degrees, working across. Soon as then we start opening up, you notice now that my the buttons on my t-shirt is actually hanging back just a fraction from my belt buckle, which is, you know, optimal to basically be in balance, but also as well, especially on driver, to be hitting up on driver, but to also be shallow. So this is the thing. So what we'll find is, right, so let's say if I push into this direction here, that is where I can then use my foot on my left foot to then push myself back to create that rotation. So I'm standing in posture as this happens. The pushing of the feet, like I said to you earlier about brakes and accelerators. So top of my backswing, right foot is acting as a braking system. Then I'm going to be using my right foot to act as a accelerator. And then my left foot is then going to obviously hold position, which is now going to act as the braking system. And then left foot is then going to take the role of using the accelerator, which is then obviously going to push the pelvis back and up, which is then going to create my rotation, rather than the pelvis just rotating. This is not a powerful move. This is not going to obviously get you hitting the ball over 300 yards. It's got to feel that we create it more through the ground.
Yep, for sure. And what are some of the issues you see with people when they try to get this for the first time? So a lot of people don't use the ground very well. A lot of people want to use the ground better. Let's say people watch this video, they understand that they're not doing what they need to do, and they're going to go away and start trying to use the ground better by working the legs into better positions. What are some things we need to look out for? Because this is obviously going to be quite a transformational difference in what we're experiencing, right? So for someone who's used to creating a lot of power through the upper half, used to using the hands and arms a lot to create their power, what are they maybe going to start to see when they do this? What are a few things they need to just watch out for?
So this is the thing. This is what I said about sort of knowing when to tie the knot on the balloon before it bursts, right? So obviously, can you do it too much? 100%. But I would really recommend doing it at dry exercises, doing this whether it's in the gym, whether it's at home and things like that, really trying to almost get the feeling of that there's some form of balance and stability there. Doing it in front of a mirror is fantastic because you obviously get to have instant feedback.
Yeah.
Right? So like I said, if I do this a little bit more in front of the mirror, shaft sitting at 45 degrees, going to coil it up nice and loaded here, and then get the feeling that it's just going to be a transfer of weight. So now I can feel, let's say, 70% of my weight now is in my left heel on my toes, but I've kept the flex on this leg, So obviously the video being about legs and feet, I've kept the flex on this rather than straightening. I've kept the flex on this leg to then get the transfer of weight into this left heel. So pressure points are right on the toes, left on the heel. And then from there, that is where I can then use my foot to then push into the ground and then obviously get this working back and around, which is obviously then going to create the extension.
So can you show us that where the club then is positioned as those movements
of course,
made?
like relative it's quite nice to where see this. All at.
Yeah.
So if I'm in this position here, let's say I'm going to be a player that needs to really kind of hold the position.
Okay.
So this is a timing of, let's say, somebody that hangs back too much. Or, no, do you know what? The opposite of that, sorry. A player that, let's say, gets over there too early.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. So we want to get the feeling that we're coiling this up. This is obviously working around and up, nice and stretched up into this position here. And then we're simply going to get the feeling that this is pushing this way. Naturally, my arms are going to want to lower because my chest is obviously creating some form of flex. So it's working into this position here, pushing to get the weight over here. This is where I can then start pushing through the left foot. The arms are then coming down because we know we get the speed mainly from the arms. That's where we're then going to be in delivery position. So the shaft is, you know, parallel to the ground. The hips have opened up just a little bit and the chest is pretty much plumb bang down the toe line.
Nice. And let's see you work that all the way through just to finish off that move. That looked good. So then let's see it all the way through and let's see how we then start to extend.
So now I'm going to be pushing into this, into the ground. The left foot's going to be pushing, which is then going to help the left shoulder work left. The right shoulder obviously cover it. And then we're obviously going to create that extension. So you can see even here, I'm pushing into the ground, create that snap kind of movement, feeling here, but I'm pushing it in a diagonal fashion to then obviously get the pelvis going back, which is then going to make me feel that I cover it. Left shoulder can work left correctly. I can stay very, very stable and balanced over it.
Awesome. Just a bit to cover on my end, which I think would be really useful. So if you just wind yourself up into that backswing, something always we just need to be aware of. Do we have enough rotation in this hip? Do we have enough rotation in that lead side in terms of external rotation in that lead side, internal rotation in this lead side? As you then work through, do we have enough mobility through the spine for this pelvis to start to open as this chest starts to stay back behind target? And as we work through now, do we have enough internal rotation in this lead side and external rotation in this side to get into this nice tilt position? So I'll take a video at the top where people can do some tests for that to see if they actually do have enough movement, because it's all very well seeing you demonstrate it for us. It looks good, athletic. We're not all as strong and athletic as Levi, unfortunately. So it'd be nice to have a little test to see if that actually is possible for us, right? And if it's not, what work do we need to do to be able to improve our mobility, improve our movement to be able to get into these correct positions?
Correct, yeah. So the video that we've just given there is very, very good for things like early extension. This isn't going into what we can use like a foot wedge for. This isn't going into what we can use as like a, let's say like a slip platform, things like that. So we can make videos for.
Maybe we'll do a ground force reaction video. It might be great.
Yeah.
I think maybe we'll do a separate one on that. I think that'd be perfect to kind of clarify some of these terms that we're using. I think that would be quite useful, and this will tie nicely into that, I think. So maybe we'll do a separate one.
Definitely, yeah. So it's very, very important how this left shoulder works in the swing, because obviously, like if we're winding it up into this position here, we then get the transfer of weight. We then start pushing. This left shoulder can then work down and left correctly for obviously the butt of the club to then swing in position, and the club, like natural forces, it can then swing onto it better. So like I said, we end up using things like the left shoulder correctly, which then can put the shaft in the correct position rather than through manipulation.
And that's kind of where I was trying to lead my question to when I said before, like when people start getting this right, what are we going to see change elsewhere? Because for a lot of reasons, probably what's happened is because they weren't using the ground right or using the legs right, they've probably made some kind of adaptation above the waistline to get away with that. And then we're going to start to see this classic chain reaction. We change one thing, we change 10. So I think maybe if we then do some extra videos on those areas, that might be good for people to start to connect the dots a little bit, because these things are all obviously connected. Yeah,
so we're going to make multiple videos together. This is the plan over the off season. So obviously everybody can then look at the videos and things like that. So everything that I've covered in this video, there's going to be questions, there's going to be comments and things like that. But this is really great exercise to get people in or out of things like early extension. Like I said, I can make 100 videos on this, honestly, and could talk for hours, but at the same time, this is quite good structure for what we're obviously trying to get in.
For sure. So do stick your comments below. We'll try and get as many answers as we can. Unfortunately, most of the questions that come in I can't answer. So I always have to try and get you to answer them.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, you're busy and it always becomes hard for us to actually get these questions answered. So do send the questions in. We will answer as many as we can. And we do see them all. So what we'll then do is if there's any that we can't quite get around to answer of people with the same question, we'll then just create a video for that and we'll just answer that question in longer form. So anything else we need to cover, legs and torso for today? I know there's a million other things.
Correct,
Anything for today that you feel we've missed?
No.
Good.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this is going to be good. We're going to start opening up a little bit more into how we can use the ground and things like that. Left shoulder, how the left shoulder works, how the wrist works, how the right shoulder works.
It's never ending.
We're gonna cover most things.
We're gonna do our best. Levi, thanks again, man. Thanks for your time.
Pleasure.